Today I'm going to be doing a follow-up video to the one I made last week on Florian Unruh's technique, because since making that video I actually talked with Florian a little bit, asked him some questions on his technique after he saw that video, and we're going to get today his kind of input, his thoughts on why he did that technique, what made him choose those things, and also some extra feedback on arrow clearance, and also on how a deep hook can actually help your shot. This is something really interesting. I gained a lot of knowledge from speaking with Florian. So firstly, thank you for giving some kind of feedback and all this kind of information. And I think you guys are going to benefit from it a lot as well. So we're going to get right into it. The first question I asked Florian is, how did you come up with this method of raising the bow with your bow arm bent slightly? Because obviously not many people do this. Like I've mentioned before, there are some, Lee Sung-Yun, Alan Wills previously, and Florian really is mainly the current one. Some people suggested and kind of mentioned that Frangili sometime kind of did this a little bit, but obviously he has more head movement in his shot and other things. But this is what I asked. I said, how did you kind of get to this point? And Florian said it evolved naturally over time when he started shooting. And essentially, because he inserted his arrow into the bow, he kind of developed that way early on. And then he didn't change that. He found that this was the easiest way, as he says here, from my position after the arrow is knocked on the string, it's the easiest way to raise and draw back the bow with a bent elbow. So that's kind of the first thing. So I guess that's kind of the initiation of where that started from. But the interesting bit is what I mentioned in the previous video. Every time I tried to raise the bow with a straight arm, I had the problems you described. Problems with my right biceps tendon and more variation in my right arm and shoulder blade, so I stayed with this technique. So this is really, really kind of good to hear, because it shows a couple of things. It shows that there's more than one way to raise the bow and shoot, and it also shows that depending on if you're struggling with the front side or the back side, or maybe you have a certain kind of bias in your shot that you always struggle with one part of it, you can find a technique that helps that. And this is where, for example, Alan Wills, if I go back to the kind of full screen camera here, he used to kind of lift up like this and then come down from this position. He used to kind of lift the bow up, put his hands on the string, his fingers on the string, and then come down. And that, I believe, was basically because of an injury in one of his shoulders that he had to do that. Florian doesn't have an injury here, but it's interesting to see that when he tried with the straighter bow arm, he felt those kind of difficult things in his right shoulder and his right biceps tendon. So, well, I shouldn't say right shoulder actually. He said it was only the right biceps tendon here, and it was just some variation in his right shoulder. But this is what I think is really good. So if we go back to this video of Florian shooting, you can clearly see that here, when he raises up here, he's keeping this shoulder, if I zoom in, he's keeping this right shoulder quite neutral through the whole raise, like I said before, without having to put too much tension on the string. So if we raise here, you can see here, this shoulder looks quite comfortable, quite easy. If you compare that to the video of Iwoo Suk that I showed before, where he has to kind of reach quite far forward with this shoulder, it's very different. So one is not better than the other. It's what works for you and how your shoulders work. Like I said in the previous video, if Iwoo Suk tried to do this, maybe he wouldn't like it. And this is the thing, it depends on how you want to shoot and what works for you. So the next thing I want to mention in this video, and I think the most interesting thing in this is actually the third point today that I want to get to, which is kind of tuning based, which I don't normally talk about a lot, because tuning is normally, it's basically as long as you get a rough tune, people spend way too much time kind of thinking about it. But on this case, there's something really useful. The second point I want to get to here, I asked Florian what were any difficulties or kind of negatives of this way of drawing that you found, and how have you kind of addressed that? So he said, the biggest challenge for me is the positioning of the bow shoulder, which we'll take a look at in a second. I think it's easier to have a good position if the arm is straight from the beginning, which makes sense, right? This is also what I've found in my experience as well. If, when you're raising the bow, if you have this front arm straight, if we just kind of move this back a little bit here, if you have this front arm straight, it's a lot easier to get this bow shoulder into position earlier, and then you've got that line, and then you can move this one around. But the difficulty, like I mentioned last time, is in this draw shoulder. So it's this constant trade-off of how you want to kind of deal with this and what pros and cons you want to take from each part of the technique. If the arm is straight from the beginning, that's what we mentioned before. The bow hand could be a problem like you described in the video, but for me it was really good most of the time. And this is a really good point, because I mentioned this last time as well. If we go to, I think it's about 10 minutes in this video, if I zoom out, here, this angle here, we can see what Florian means with the bow shoulder. So if we move to here, when he raises up, you can see in this position he hasn't really directed his bow shoulder forward yet because of that bent arm, and it's going to take a little bit more time in the shot in order to do that. He does get a great position, but like he said, this is the thing that's maybe most difficult for him in this part of the shot, and then he gets in this position now, it's really good. So it's a little bit later maybe, because like you saw, if you have that straight arm from the beginning, it's a little bit easier. But this is a great kind of example of the trade-off, and we'll see here. It's not the end where he shoots the crazy 3/6s, but anyway, that's the part with the bow shoulder. What I want to show now as well, if I can find it, is the angle of his bow hand. So, because this is really, really interesting. He said it's not a problem for him most of the time, and this is what I saw in the video last time. Although I thought maybe it could be a challenge, clearly his positioning of his bow hand is really, really good, because like I showed in the previous video, it looks super solid once he raises up. So I think some of these clips kind of, there we go, this one. Some of these clips aren't long enough, but you'll see here, in this position he hasn't set the hand yet, and now he's about to direct through. I'll zoom in a little bit more. He's about to direct through more with the thumb and then release these fingers off of the grip, as you can see in a second. So direct through, direct with the thumb, and now this position is great. And through the shots that I've looked at, it looks super consistent. And this is exactly what he said on the message when we were talking as well, is actually this position looks really good. Also, if you look at Lee Seung-Yeon's technique, where he does a similar thing when he raises the bow, his bow hand positioning is really, really good as well. So although I mentioned it could be a bit tricky, maybe this is not the hardest part of the technique. Maybe the bow shoulder, I haven't tried shooting like this, but maybe the bow shoulder is the harder point of the technique here with this, because of that later kind of getting into line. So this is just what I wanted to show there. Bow hand looks great as well. And now I want to get to the kind of third and final point, which I'll spend a little bit more time on. I asked about the hook, so let's just move that up a little bit. I asked about the hook here, and if we go like this, I asked and said, it looks like your hook is really important to get very, very solid, like it's a really important part of your technique to get solid, and we can see this from some of the other angles. If we go back to this beginning one, you can see how much time Florian spends on his hook here. See how he's getting the hook, really getting it secure, and then finally comes up here. He spends a lot more time than a lot of people do. And then also what we mentioned as well, I don't know where the clip is, but you can see here, half obscured by the graphic, but there's another shot in a second on maybe a different angle. Here, you can see his hook is a bit deeper than a lot of archers. So this is what I asked about. I said, it looks like it's really important to you. Have you tried a more shallow hook? What were the pros and cons to the different hooks that you tried? And what made you kind of settle on this deeper hook? And this is where it got really interesting. So, yes, I really like the deep hook. For the first few years, I had a shallow hook and I had problems with calloused skin. And this is quite interesting. I've got a picture of Iwoo Suk's hook, which is definitely more shallow, and you cannot argue with his fingers being pretty destroyed. So this is quite an interesting point for people who might struggle with calluses, a slightly deeper hook. So I experimented with a deeper hook and it went away, and so I stayed with the hook. In my opinion, the benefits are fewer problems with the skin, i.e. the calluses that Florian just mentioned, less tension in the forearm, and a more relaxed release. So this is really interesting. We'll get into this in a little bit more detail in a second. The drawbacks I can think of are the need for a stiffer arrow and a little less acceleration distance, because the arrow leaves the fingers later. The stiffer arrow is needed because there is more horizontal acceleration when the string has to move more of the fingers. So there's a lot to dive in here. Let's start with the calluses. Calluses and forearm tension. If you're in this position and you have a slightly shallower hook, you're still maybe, in the groove, slightly behind the groove and slightly in front of the groove on the ring finger, you're going to have to use a little bit more forearm tension to hold those fingers from coming off the string, especially if you shoot quite a high poundage. That's just how it's going to work. So what Florian's mentioning here is, instead of if we're like this, if we have a little bit more of a deeper hook, he found that he can relax the forearm here a little bit more, and then later on that gives a better release. And also the skin. The reason for this as well with the skin is, if you imagine the string is in the groove here and on the hand, if it's quite close to the fingertips, especially if it's past these joints and kind of onto the pad of the finger at all, especially on this bottom finger. That's why you see a lot of people get quite a strong callus on this bottom finger as well. The string can kind of like push the fleshy part of the finger like this and kind of like build up the kind of meaty part of your finger, and then it ends up basically putting a lot of pressure on, and then when the string flicks off the finger, then it can basically create that callus. So essentially what Florian is saying here is, when the hook was a little bit deeper, it was more like the whole digit of the finger moved out of the way, rather than the string being on the pad and it kind of brushing the pad quite strongly, which would then create more of a callus type thing. So that's the callus, and that's the forearm kind of tension. And it's this forearm tension here that Florian mentions that helps with that relaxed release that he mentioned as well, because yes, like I said in the video, maybe Florian's fingers are a bit more outward than you might see from, let's say, Kibo Bay or something like that. But if this is relaxed, and if the elbow execution, like I showed in the video, if that is great, it doesn't matter. I think I was going to play this video, but I think it cuts out. Oh no, you do see the release. So we see the release here. This wasn't Florian's best shot, to be fair. You could see he didn't like that one as much, but still, even with this, it looks like the back elbow. So there's a little bit of a coming off of the back elbow there, but still not a bad shot. So my point here is, having the slight relaxed forearm then allows also the hand to be a little bit more relaxed here on the back of the hand and the wrist, and overall Florian feels like that gives a more relaxed release. So that's that part. Now he mentions about the drawbacks, but this is kind of my favourite part, because this has actually solved something that I spent ages trying to work out and fix, and I think a lot of archers, especially kind of national level archers, maybe have kind of struggled with this, or even if there's a club archer that has been able to get a high-speed camera to look at their clearance, they've probably struggled with this as well. So anyone who's looked at a high-speed video really, or anyone with struggled clearance problems, anyone who's struggled with that has probably come into this. And this is, he said it's a drawback, but you need a stiffer arrow. So, okay, because the arrow leaves the fingers later, the stiffer arrow is needed because there is more horizontal acceleration. This is the key bit. The stiffer arrow is needed because there's more horizontal acceleration. If the fingers are deeper on the string, then the string is going to have to basically go this way more to brush past the fingers on the moment of release. And I'm going to show you this now. I've got some slow motion video here. So let's start with this here. So what I struggled with for a while, I mentioned earlier, is at one point I had my bow tuned, arrow spine, like I always say, arrow spine, arrow length and poundage all matched together, and the arrow is bending fine, but it was just a little bit close, as you're going to see now, to the arrow rest. So the clearance, just like that. So you can see here, there's not a clearance problem, but when you look at the arrow, the shaft just taps the arrow rest there, and it is quite close to the bow here, you can see. And then afterwards it clears, there's no problem, but it was a bit close for comfort, and whatever I did, it was always like this. When I changed the poundage, same. Changed the button tension, same. Center shot, same. Changed the string position on the face, maybe I thought that the chin drag was causing it to Not clear as much, same. Basically everything was the same that I could think of. What I didn't change was really trying a deeper hook. Because now let's have a look. The reason, as it turns out now, after speaking with Florian, the reason that this was happening is because essentially it was an inherent part of my technique from the release. Because my hook was more shallow, the arrow wasn't having to bend around the fingers as much, and the arrow wasn't getting, as you can see here, the amplitude, how much it's bending is just quite small. It's bending in the correct way and at the correct time, because at this point here you can see the knock is kind of the furthest from the bow as it's clearing the rest. So the timing is correct, the tuning is correct, but it's just like the amplitude has been dampened a little bit, and that's because of the release. So if we now go to Florian, there's a clip in this video from the back somewhere, maybe it's already, I think. So here it is. Same angle, and here you can see the clearance is much better. You can see that the distance between the arrow and the rest here is much bigger. There's no tapping of the arrow rest at all. Arrow rest is completely fine, and the amount that the arrow is bending is much bigger. Maybe it's hard to see in this because of the frame by frame, but now if we go to a kind of higher quality slow motion video here, let's go to Kibo Bay. And let's have a look at this. And this is something that always, I was trying to work out what causes some archers to have this. Look at the arrow bend here. Look at the amount of bending that the arrow does. You can just clearly see the amplitude of that bending is much bigger than in my example. And here again, there's no issue with the arrow rest. If we have another example here, let's look at Zach Garrett. So let's go here, and you can see from 2016, you can see here, huge bending of the arrow, massively clears the rest, absolutely no problem at all. And then finally, if we go to Brady here, and we have a look, we can see in a second, just a bit of tapping of the arrow rest. So this variation is caused by the difference in the hooking primarily, and this is why this is kind of solved something, like I mentioned, that I've been struggling with for ages, and I couldn't work out what the cause was. But if we go back now to this, there were two archers, I won't name them here in case they didn't want to be named, but there were two other archers on the German team that Florian mentioned, two of his teammates, and he said they both struggled with clearance problems because of a shallow hook. This is exactly what I was mentioning, and had no problems with it after switching to a deeper hook. Just a little bit, and it wasn't as deep as Florian's hook. So I think this is really useful to know, really interesting for anyone who struggled with this, for anyone who's looked at clearance videos and had this issue. Looking at the release is definitely an area that you can check, because I mean this video here, you can see at the top of the screen, it names the, you know, what everything, all the equipment is. 44 pounds, 450 X10s, Eastern pin nocks, you know, 232mm brace height, all of this, because I was going through using the high-speed camera, changing basically everything to try and get this clearance better, and whatever I did, it didn't do anything because I was looking at the wrong thing. It should have been the hook, and a slightly deeper hook might just have been the thing that I needed in order to get this. So I think this is super interesting. It solved that mystery of why some people have a larger bend of the arrow than others. And also, if we go back to, let's go to Kibo Bay here, you see this initial, and this is getting quite detailed now, but you see this initial point where the arrow is bending. See that tap of the button, this tap of the pressure button here. See how the pressure button gets pushed inwards, and then it pushes the arrow, and then the arrow leaves. So that's what the pressure button does, right? One of my issues with this, when I was shooting, is I was wondering what the pressure button is doing. Because if you look closely, and we go frame by frame, it doesn't look like it's doing anything. So my issue with this is, or was at the time, I don't think I'm getting the benefit of a forgiving tune with a pressure button which is having some forgiveness, because it doesn't look like it's compressing at all. So I might as well be shooting a pressure button with a wooden stick in it. And this, again, is because of that horizontal acceleration, because it has to clear the fingers a little bit more in Kibo Bay's example, in Florian's example, in Zach Garrett's example, I think in Brady's example as well, if we go to Brady here. So it's a little bit less of a bend than Zach Garrett's, but you can see this initial hit of the pressure button, where pressure button goes in there. That's what's going to give you that forgiveness, because you've got the spring, and that's what's going to give you, the wider group, tighter grouping, not wider grouping. So this is really, really important as well. And I think if anyone has a chance to play with a high-speed camera after watching this video, I'd be really interested to hear in the comments below what you've experienced, if you've used a high-speed camera before and had a similar thing. If you have one, maybe you've got one of those Samsung phones that can do the high speed, I'd be really interested to hear, maybe you can send me a message on Telegram of how the before and after looks when you use the deeper hook, that kind of thing, because I think this is really, really fascinating. So I've rambled on a little bit longer than I expected for this video. I also forgot to say, I forgot to sponsor myself. But if you haven't checked it out already, definitely check out my Online Archery Academy courses. I've got a beginner's course, which covers everything you need to know to start archery up to becoming a competent club level archer. And then I've got my advanced recurve technique course. Now this is basically, we cover literally every single thing you need to know about recurve archery. You can see here, deep hook versus secure hook. This is what we were just talking about. Maybe I need to add another section to this now as well. You've got bow on the foot versus bow on the leg, your stance, your posture, literally everything you need to know, setup, draw and full draw, everything you need to know. I'll guide you through step by step every section. I think there's about 5 hours total of videos here, and you get lifetime access for a one-time fee here of just £199 as well. So check that out if you haven't already. I'll put a little discount in the description and comments below. And then finally as well, if you haven't already, subscribe and become an OAA member today. You get all of this on my website. You get all of the full technique guides, all of the blog posts, all of my drills and training library and all of that. And you can also send me questions for Q&As that I answer in my Telegram community that I mentioned earlier. So yeah, that's what I'd recommend there if you haven't checked those out already. If you don't want to do anything paid yet, simply go to my homepage here and then just put your email address in, and you'll get my free weekly newsletter with 3 tips that I send out every week as well. So that's it from me today, and I'll see you in the next video.